Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 16th EPIP webinar of 2014, using a gender lens to enhance outcomes and drive innovation. I am your EPIP host for this afternoon's webinar, Michael Barham. Many of you may recognize my voice from webinars earlier this year. We're joined by Jennifer Lockwood-Shabat of Washington Area Women's Foundation. We're going to learn a lot about what they're doing, specifically with their two-generation work. It should be very interesting. I know we have a bunch of folks excited to join today. Before we toss it over to them, I'm going to familiarize those of you who don't know much about EPIP with who we are and what we do. We're a national network of foundation professionals and social entrepreneurs who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We're also an inclusive group of highly skilled and effective change makers committed to working together to making the world working together to build a just, equitable, and sustainable society. Beyond just who we are, what do? We provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice leadership skills, and voice emerging transformative thoughts in the social sector. We're hoping to do a bit of everything here today, and especially we're hoping to learn something today. I think we will. So we're excited to get started. Those of you who aren't EPIP members yet, it's a great time to join. We have plenty of webinars on tap for the rest of the year, plenty of local events hopefully near you. National conference that we're planning for the spring, with more info to come there. So if you're interested, just want to learn more about what we do, reach out to me, check out the website, epip.org/membership. And again, I'm always happy to talk more about EPIP. Some announcements, upcoming events. Next webinar, make sure to mark your calendars 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, November 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern. The Future of Philanthropy, a closer look at youth grant making. We're joined by friends and partners at the Foundation Center and Free to See Fox Family Foundation. We're going to learn about the first landscape scan that was conducted by the Foundation Center and Youth Philanthropy Connect on youth grant making. We'll learn what's happening in the field of youth philanthropy to prepare for the massive intergenerational wealth transfer. So it should be really interesting. I know they're very excited. We're going to have a number of speakers, so it should be a lot of fun. Those of you in the New York City area, we're throwing a very exciting fundraiser, the Party to Share Prosperity. It's a Giving Tuesday event. EPIP National and our New York chapter are partnering to do so. It's taking place Tuesday, November 2nd, 2014. Yes, that is Giving Tuesday. And even if you're not in New York, you can nominate a cause that you're passionate about. We're going to be splitting the proceeds with the cause that gets the most votes. So tweet at EPIP New York, hashtag Giving Tuesday. It's a great opportunity to get some support for a nonprofit, a charity that you care about. So please do that. And do that now, because we're actually terminating voting next week. So there's only a few days left to make that happen. Many of you on our mailing list may have heard about MC Mal, and hopefully you read your email because it came out today. But if you hadn't, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about it. We've been working to develop and refine two really important member resources. Measuring a Leader and Member Connect. Measuring a Leader is a set of 7 skills and values that EPIP, in collaboration with human resource experts, has identified as vital for emerging leaders in the social sector. Member Connect is the online member community interactive toolkit wherein EPIP members can search and connect with other members, access, create new content, and closely track measuring a leader's skill development. So MC Mal comprises these two really important tools and components we've been working on. Starting In November, this is actually the first month, we're launching a 7-month MC-MAL applied learning campaign to raise awareness and highlight different ways that EPIP members can learn or practice a specific skill. Each month focuses on one of 7 measuring a leader's skill sets, and we've dedicated November to measuring a leader's influencing and fundraising skill set, which actually aligns really well with what we're hoping to do with Giving Tuesday at the beginning of the next month. So take a look at your email. Visit our website. Right on the front, you'll see a blog that'll tell you more about this. It's a really exciting launch for us. It's something we've been working on in kind of response to what our members have been telling us for a while. So please take a look at the website and learn more about that. And again, reach out to the staff. We're happy to tell you more about it. And as usual, for all events, epip.org/events, and you'll learn about national events and events near you. Couple of items of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question or any technical difficulties, use the question box. We're saving time for Q&A as well. You can type questions in as you have them, and we'll monitor them throughout the webinar. You can also just save them for the last 10 or 15 minutes when we have time with Q&A with our speakers. We will be recording the webinar, so please visit our website next week. It should be up if you have to jump off early, and help us out, help us improve the webinar program. We're always working to hone and refine it, so please complete the post-webinar survey and tell us how we can improve these webinars. Okay, today's speaker, Jennifer Lockwood-Shabat, of President and CEO of Washington Area Women's Foundation. Jennifer is the president and CEO there. It's a public foundation dedicated to mobilizing the community to ensure that economically vulnerable women and girls in Washington, D.C. metropolitan region have the resources they need to thrive. She's devoted her entire career to improving the lives of low-income and underserved women and girls. Prior to joining the Women's Foundation, Jennifer served as the Director of Public Policy at the National Family Planning and Reproductive Health Association, where she advocated on behalf of publicly funded family planning clinics and worked to improve access to family planning services for the low-income and uninsured. Before that, she actually spent 10 years at Women's Policy, Inc., where she directed the organization's policy research and analysis and worked extensively with the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. So as you can see, she's well-suited. We're going to learn a lot about what she's doing now. And without further ado, I am actually going to pass it over to Jennifer and our friends at the Washington Area Women's Foundation. Hang on there with us just a second, folks, and we'll be sharing their screen and hearing from them. Hi, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me to present on today's webinar. I'm always excited and happy to talk about Washington Area Women's Foundation and the work that we do, but also how it's improving our outcomes and influencing the community in which we work. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here with you today. I'm also joined by Lauren Stillwell, who is our program officer, and she may on occasion jump in if I've forgotten something or missing, and will also be available for Q&A as well. So for today, the topic is really about using a gender lens to enhance outcomes and drive innovation. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about who we are and what we do. Then I wanted to share a couple of case studies that illuminate our work. And then finally end with a couple of key takeaways and hopefully leave plenty of time for Q&A. So with that, who are we and what do we do? Michael gave a great introduction where he shared our mission statement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but I thought it would be helpful to start out with our history. So we are a public foundation that was founded in 1998 by a group of women who came together and were surprised to learn that there really wasn't a strong philanthropic focus on women and girls in the nation's capital. And many of the women were familiar with other women's funds or foundations, either in Colorado or California, and felt that there really should be that kind of a women's funds focus here in the nation's capital and the Washington metropolitan region. So they banded together and in the first year pooled their resources and ended up granting out about $17,000 to a number of fairly small organizations working with women and girls across the region. And then it grew exponentially from there. Our mission at our founding was broadly to improve the lives of women and girls, and we operated a number of different grant-making programs and giving circles, but they weren't necessarily strategically aligned, nor did they have a specific issue area focus. For about the next 6 years or so, we grew fairly organically. It was really by word of mouth, one woman to another woman, sort of slowly raising the resources. As a public foundation, we do raise every dollar that we then use to operate and grant out into the community, so we're not pulling from an endowment, so to speak. And I think the thing that really put us on the map in 2003 was the release of our first research report called the Portrait Project. And that particular report documented the needs and challenges of women and girls across the region. And it was the first time that that kind of information was collated, put together, and shared with the community. We then used that research to create what is now our signature economic security grant-making program called Stepping Stones. We launched that in 2005, and with the launch of Stepping Stones, we were really able to attract both national and local funding that allowed us to exponentially grow in a relatively short period of time, and allowed us to reach about $1 million in grant making per year, which is what we currently do. As a result of the Stepping Stones work, back in 2010, we underwent a strategic planning process, and we really honed our organizational focus and mission to be about mobilizing our community to ensure that economically vulnerable women and girls have the resources they need to thrive. We define the Washington metropolitan region to be about, we're funding in the District of Columbia, in Arlington and Fairfax counties in Virginia, and Montgomery and Prince George's County in Maryland. As I said, we are a grant maker, and that is sort of the primary activity that we use to achieve our mission, but there are also several other activities that we engage in. I mentioned just a minute ago the Portrait Project. Research is a very critical component of our work. We are very data-driven, and we use research to really guide our programmatic work. We do original research that's designed to demonstrate the challenges and opportunities facing low-income women and girls across the region. But then we also use that research to educate the community and other key stakeholders about that need. Another big part of our mission is catalyzing women's philanthropy. As I mentioned earlier, this is how we were founded, and it's an important part of our work to encourage women to give and to grow their philanthropy over time. Overall, we are a fairly small but mighty organization. We have a total budget of about $3 million, and we do just over $1 million in grant making annually. I want to talk a little bit about that grant making before I go into the case studies. Stepping Stones, which is our economic security grant making program, was designed to improve the economic security of low-income women and their families. And we first launched the program back in 2005, and at the time, the research showed us that single women-headed families were the most economically vulnerable population in our region. Overall, their poverty rates were significantly higher than others, and they were also much more likely to fall deeper into poverty with just one adverse life event. So we took that research to design the grant-making program. The research showed that there were 3 particular issues that were independent in perpetuating the cycle of poverty. The first issue was around asset building. We define that to be financial education and wealth building opportunities. So it's things like understanding how to put together a family budget, understanding if you've accumulated debt, how you decrease that debt, what does it look like to begin saving, not only for future expenses, but also for future lifetime things like education for children or retirement. Tax credits are a big part of our asset building strategy, particularly the earned income tax credit. And then in addition, housing and home ownership, and how does that fit into building assets for lower income women. The second issue that we focus on is around workforce development, and this is really about ensuring that women are trained for jobs with family-sustaining wages and benefits, and that these jobs have very clear career pathways so that women understand if they enter at A, there's an opportunity for them to move up the ladder to B and C. The third issue area that we focus on is early care and education, and we really approach this sort of a three-prong approach. The first is about ensuring that children are ready to enter kindergarten, ready to learn and succeed. The second piece is approaching this as a work support for women who are either moving through a job training program or working. It's critically important that they have a place where their children are cared for in a nurturing and loving environment, but also learning at the same time. And then thirdly, from a professional development perspective, the majority of early care providers are low-income women. So how do we think about creating viable careers and a pipeline for women as well? So these three issue areas are the pillars of our grant making. The fourth icon that you'll see on the slide is around two-generation work, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So I just right now want to focus on assets, workforce, and early care and education. We began funding this work back in 2005. We brought each of these pillars online in a slightly different time frame. So our initial investments were in asset building and workforce development, 2005 through 2008, and then in 2008 we added the early care portion to our portfolio. Since we launched Stepping Stones, we have invested over $7 million in women and girls in the region. That's allowed us to serve over 10,000 women, and that's resulted in an increase in their income and assets of $45 million over that time. I wanted to talk a little bit about our unique position here at the Women's Foundation. I think there are a couple of factors that uniquely position us in this work, particularly as a funder. The first is our gender lens. Being very squarely focused on the needs of women and girls gives us an area of expertise that no one else in our community has. We are the only funder regionally that's focused specifically on women and girls. This gives us the opportunity to educate and influence others to perhaps think about their work and their programs slightly differently. So we're often at tables where other groups and organizations are funding a variety of work, and we have the opportunity sometimes to simply ask the question, how does this impact the women you're serving in your programs? Are you seeing a difference between your outcomes for women and girls versus boys and men? And what are the challenges that you're seeing? And then we're able to provide additional resources and expertise that can help guide organizations in thinking that through. We also, as I mentioned, have a very narrow focus on economic security, and that actually has been very intentional, specifically over the last 4 to 5 years. I mentioned earlier when we were first founded, our mission was about broadly improving the lives of women and girls, and that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So as we went through our strategic planning process, we really had to take a step back and figure out what is the area of expertise that we have as Washington Area Women's Foundation, and what is our value add in the community. And when we did that, we really settled on economic security. That was where our core area of expertise was. That's where we were having tremendous outcomes through our grant making in the community. And so we felt it was important to elevate that economic security work to really be about the mission of the organization in totality. Data-driven grant making. This is incredibly important to me. We are very data-driven in our grant making, but I will say not so much that we're inflexible in how we approach the work. So we certainly look at the needs of the community so that we understand where are there deep pockets of poverty, where is the greatest need for women and girls, and then we work to invest our dollars accordingly. We also very carefully analyze the grant outcomes through our evaluation, and with that, we're able to course correct as needed. So if a particular strategy isn't working, we are small enough and nimble enough that we're able to work with organizations to make changes along the way if needed. As a local funder, we have a bird's eye view and on-the-ground knowledge of what's really happening in our community. And I think that also because we are both a public foundation and a women's foundation, we really pride ourselves in our close and deep connection to the community. We very much see ourselves as a partner with others in the community. We refer to our grantees as Grantee Partners because we truly do see this as a partnership with them. And then lastly, voice and influence. I think this is something that we are really stepping into and owning in a little bit more of a proactive way than maybe we have in the past. But I think as a funder, we really have the ability to use our voice and influence to create greater change in the community. We, over time, have built a strong reputation in the DC region. We're considered a trusted resource and an expert, and I think that allows us to pull together and convene maybe what some would refer to as unlikely allies in order to discuss tough issues, illuminate problems, and focus on the strategies that are best suited to really change the outcomes for low-income women and girls in our community. So I wanted to share with you just 2 case studies that demonstrate how this plays out in our work. And the first case study is Goodwill of Greater Washington. And this is particularly important to me, and I'm probably most proud of this example since my time at the Women's Foundation. I've been here almost 7 years. But Goodwill of Greater Washington is, I'm sure you're all very familiar with Goodwills across the country, but they're a multi-million-dollar organization operating throughout the Washington region. They have a much larger footprint than what we actually do here at the Women's Foundation. But they're a great example of an organization that had never really thought about how a gender lens impacted their work. So going back to 2005, when we first launched Stepping Stones, we put an RFP out into the community, really looking for organizations to apply for planning grants, to think about how would they provide services, either financial education or job training, to low-income women. So Goodwill responded to that first RFP. And what I think is most interesting about it is that up until that point, as I said, they hadn't really thought about a gender lens and were their outcomes for men and women different in their programs. And even just responding to the RFP caused them to dig a little bit deeper and look at their outcomes and analyze it by gender. And they ended up discovering that their outcomes for women were worse than they were for men. And so it was the first time they'd really thought about it. And it's what spurred them to think about how do we serve women slightly differently from men. And they initially applied to do a planning grant to think about creating a job training program for women in construction. So they underwent a year of planning, and then they moved to implementation. And the first year of implementation was really interesting because they came back and said, wow, we've learned so much from working with this cohort of women, and we didn't realize the number of challenges that this particular cohort of women has. And it's unlike anything we've encountered in our other programs. And they discovered that the teachers providing the training were spending a great deal of time counseling women on things like transportation, public benefits, child care, They were all things that are what we call wraparound services or wraparound supports that were needed in order for the women to succeed in the program, but were certainly not part of the actual job training curriculum itself. So after a year of this, Goodwill came back to us and said, we'd like to hire a case manager who works with these women one-on-one specifically to address the needs and challenges. And so for the next several years, that is essentially what our grant funded, a case manager to work with the women. Fast forward a couple more years, and Goodwill came back to us to say they had done a look at their own internal policies and procedures and realized that as an employer, they were not providing the same level of services and wraparound support for their own employees as they were for the women moving through their job training program. And so they took a step back as an organization, revamped their HR, and really had a cultural shift as to how they, as an employer, engaged with the low-income women and men who were working for them. So it's just a tremendous example of how one RFP sort of spurred their thinking about their outcomes as an organization that led to a change in their service delivery, but then ultimately led to a change in how they as an employer interact with and provide services to their own employees. So the second case study is around a new body of work that we just launched in 2005, and this is our two-generation work. We're really excited about this. As part of our strategic planning process, we wanted to take a lifespan approach to our work. Up until that point in time, we had really been focused on single women-headed families, so providing a set of services and supports to women specifically. But we recognized that if we truly wanted to break the cycle of poverty, we needed to be looking at multiple generations. It wasn't enough to solely invest in and work with a group of women. In many cases, sometimes it's a grandmother raising a granddaughter, and we needed to think about what that work looked like and how to work with multiple generations. We spent approximately a year and a half landscaping what work could look like around the needs of girls and young women in the community. And on the slide here, I've shared just a couple of data pieces that we walked away with. The first, on the quantitative side, we spent a lot of time gathering the data to demonstrate the needs and challenges for girls and young women. The first one is that 1 in 10 girls in our region did not complete high school in 2008. And the DC public schools actually have the lowest graduation rate in the country at 60%. The other stat that jumped out at us was really around teen pregnancy, which probably comes as no surprise to many of you on the phone, but this really does impact a mother's educational attainment and her long-term economic security. In our region, 40% of teen mothers are likely to have graduated from high school, and just 2% of girls who have children by the age of 18 actually finish college by the age of 20, the age of 30. And that significantly impacts their earnings potential and their future economic security. In addition to gathering the quantitative data, though, we spent a lot of time also gathering qualitative data. It was important for us that the voices of women and girls in our community be a part of our planning process and really lend their voice to shape a deeper and stronger narrative that backed up the data. So we did a series of focus groups with girls and young women and providers across the region to get their input around what does economic security look like to them, what does this mean, what are their hopes, their dreams. And what we found kind of glaringly came across time and time again was that there really was a critical gap in services and funding for middle school aged youth. There was a lot of programming out there in the early care and education and the elementary school space, and there was a lot happening in the high school space. But those middle school years were a little bit forgotten, and there wasn't much in terms of program or funding, and there were very few policies that focused on this work with a gender lens specifically. So using both the quantitative and qualitative data, we decided to focus on middle school age girls and their female caregivers. We know that middle school is a very difficult transition, even under the best of circumstances. It's a time when girls are highly influenced by their peers and their environment. And it's also a time when they begin making decisions that can ultimately have long-term impact on the trajectory of their lives. And so for that reason, we really wanted to focus on middle school age girls and their female caregivers. We chose the term female caregivers because it's not always necessarily a mother who's shaping and guiding that young woman. It can be a grandmother, a foster parent, an aunt, a friend. It's really that woman who is in charge of guiding and shaping her. So we were very intentional about the language to be as inclusive as possible. Based on the data, we set out 3 goals for this particular piece of work for the girls specifically. The first is to empower girls as social change agents. As I mentioned earlier, it was important to us that the voice of girls and young women be a part of our planning process. And carrying that through, it's important that they have the tools and the skills necessary to find their own voice, to advocate for themselves and for improvements for programs in their community. And so that was a really important component and goal for us. The second is around supporting high school completion. As I mentioned, the data bears out that this is fairly abysmal, and so it was important for us to think through what does it take to ensure that girls are completing high school, and also thinking about what's next, what's after high school. The third goal is around encouraging positive choices that decrease risky behavior and early pregnancy and ultimately increase health and well-being. As I mentioned earlier, teen pregnancy is an issue that we wanted to focus on. It was important as we think about how do we ensure girls are completing high school. A part of that is trying to delay pregnancy as long as possible. In terms of our process, once we had defined the population we wanted to work with, set out the goals that we were trying to achieve, we then did a request for proposals that we put out into the community. And with this RFP, we were really looking for collaborative efforts. So we were interested in either cross-sector or it could be within the same sector, but really we were looking for groups interested in coming together to collaborate on how they could provide a set of services to a cohort of middle school age girls and their female caregivers at the same time. I think we learned a lot with this particular RFP because we were very clear that we were willing to do planning dollars or implementation dollars. We weren't necessarily expecting organizations to apply saying, we have a program fully shaped and ready to go. We knew that this was very new work. It was innovative. Our research showed that there wasn't any kind of a 2-generation program focused on middle school age girls across the country, so that we knew it was very new. Interestingly, we did not get any proposals back that were collaborative efforts. But as we went through the site visit process, there were 3 organizations that rose to the top for a couple of different reasons. One, they each had an area of expertise that really lent itself nicely to this work and paired together would be very complementary. And they were all looking at working essentially within the same geographic footprint. So we took a step back as a funder and decided, I wonder what this would mean if we funded straight planning, just sit in a room and talk about what this could possibly look like, rather than moving to separate grants around implementation. So we actually went back to the 3 organizations before taking anything to our board and just engaged in a conversation with them. Are you interested in collaborating with these other organizations? If so, what do you think that would look like? Would you like us to be a part of that process? And are you interested in a planning grant to do that? And it turned out that all 3 were very interested. They had been talking about how to collaborate with one another, but they just never really had the time, space, or dollars to think about how to sit down and plan for the work. So we ultimately ended up funding, we did 3 planning grants, one to the YWCA of the National Capital Area, another to College Success Foundation, and a third to the DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative. So we made those grants last December. The organizations started meeting at the beginning of this year. They've been meeting almost at least once a month, a couple months bi-monthly, and we've been very much a part of the planning process. So Lauren Stowell, our program officer, has been at those meetings helping to facilitate the planning, providing them with resources that they might need in order to think about what this work could look like collaboratively. And they're in the tail ends of completing that planning process, and we should know by December of this year what that work ultimately looks like and how they may want to move forward to an implementation phase. So lastly, I wanted to leave you with a few key takeaways that I think might be helpful as you think about how using a gender lens can enhance your outcomes and drive innovation. I think the first is it is possible to incorporate a gender lens into your work where appropriate. We certainly, this is explicit in our mission and our work, but I think what we've learned from working with our grantee partners and other key stakeholders in the community is that oftentimes, even when they ask the question around what are the needs of women, they learn so much more about how to improve services and programming, and that ultimately leads to better outcomes. I think the second key takeaway is around utilizing data. I think it's really important to use data as you're thinking about work and what that means to you. We're certainly very data-driven, but as I said, we don't allow it to sort of hold us in one pattern and not be flexible and move as needed. The third one is around seeking opportunities to fill critical gaps in programming through your funding. This is something that we certainly discovered with the True Generation work. I think as we went into that landscaping process, I don't know that we would have said going into it, oh, we're absolutely going to serve a cohort of middle school age girls and their moms. We were very open to what we learned through that process, and it was really understanding that there was a critical gap that we then had the opportunity to fill. It's also, I think, a little bit about not being afraid to try something new. This is very new work for us. It's not necessarily guaranteed that we're going to come out in December and have a perfect program that's ready to be implemented. It might be that 2 of the partners say we're ready and the 3rd is not. We'll see what that looks like, but it was about being willing to try something that was new and innovative, which I think we were uniquely positioned to do. I think the fourth key takeaway is around funding thoughtful planning, and this was really important to us as we went through this process. Again, not knowing when we went into it that we would land where we did around funding the planning, but it was clear that we couldn't give organizations 3 weeks to create an entirely new program and be ready to go to implement by responding to an RFP. And for us, being both a grantor and a grantee, we understand the time that it takes to think through new work and the resources that you have to invest in order to do that. So I'm really proud that we were able to step back and fund very thoughtful planning with 3 organizations and be a part of that planning process along the way. Also, embrace your role as a convener. This is something I think we actually don't do a good enough job sort of bragging about our role as a convener, but it's something that we do on a fairly regular basis, and as a funder, I think it's a critical opportunity to bring together various entities, whether it's community organizations, local government, other funders, other nonprofits, to really sit around the same table and talk about a problem and set of strategies to address that problem. And sometimes it's those conversations that can ultimately lead to a systemic change or greater change that is above and beyond any grant that we would make in the community. So our role as a convener is critically important and something that I actually think we need to do a better job of embracing and talking more about. And then lastly, raising the voice of the community. I think this is another critical takeaway that's very important. Again, as a funder, we have an opportunity to use our voice to leverage and amplify voices in the community. So there have been occasions where we're asked to weigh in on something, and simply because we're a funder, it carries a slightly different weight than maybe another nonprofit. So it's not to say that we are in any way stepping on toes or trying to overtake work that's already happening, but how do we use our leverage and our power in the community and use our voice to actually amplify the efforts of others, which and then in turn creates greater impact. So I think that I will stop there and open it up for questions.
That was really, really interesting, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that. And as she mentioned, we would like to open the floor for questions. We definitely have some time. I certainly have plenty of questions, and I'm interested to learn more. Looks like we have one that came in already from Nicole. Nicole's question is, have any reports been published by you all or by other organizations that speak about the importance of incorporating a gender lens into programming?
There are. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. There are a couple. So the Women's Funding Network, which is our umbrella organization for women's funds, both domestically and internationally, I know that they have some resources around gender lens. I also believe Grantcraft has some resources around incorporating a gender lens. Many of those are likely to be more philanthropically focused than actual direct service and programming. And then Lauren, do you want to add something about our case study?
Sure. So I'll just add that last year we released a case study that looked at 6 years of our investments in job training programs. It was specifically for women who were going through programs targeting non-traditional occupations for women. But in there, we incorporated a lot of lessons learned that had to do specifically about the kind of gender approach to that work, which, as Jennifer alluded to earlier, was new for a lot of these organizations and these particular programs. So there are certainly examples from our case study and other women's foundations about the ways in which the gender lens has made a difference in their investments.
Great, thanks for those answers. I actually have a few questions for you all. I know, and obviously we've talked a little about reports and research already, but you mentioned your focus on research and how you're kind of a respected voice at the table. I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit more about the role the research has done in kind of lifting up the work that you're doing.
Sure. I mean, I think I'll go back historically to the Portrait Project in 2003. For us, that was a groundbreaking report. It was the first time that data had been collected locally. Other nonprofits are still, we updated that report in 2010, and we will be updating it much more regularly on an annual basis moving forward. But that research is still used by policymakers, nonprofits, and other key stakeholders in the media, in our community, whenever they're talking about women and girls in the region. So it's funny, sometimes we'll see proposals and our research is quoted in the proposals coming from nonprofits in the community, but part of that is because that's the only data out there. The other piece is whenever we're at the table, and Lauren can give some great examples recently, some meetings that she's been participating in, of conversations where they're talking about a specific issue, but the data has not been analyzed by gender. And so we're always asking the question, well, how do the outcomes look for girls and women versus boys and men? Or have you looked at that? Are there differences? If there are, what are the differences? And that's just led to some really interesting conversations, because sometimes data and research is not always analyzed with a gender lens. But I think it's important in terms of having those conversations. You want to share a couple of examples?
Sure. So I'll just add, there is a cradle to career effort around youth in the District of Columbia And it was really kind of as simple as us participating in various conversations. And in one instance, the focus was on disconnected youth and how do we change the trajectory of the dropout rate in DC public schools. So they were undertaking a very large research study to look at the data in the school system, and I simply asked, are you taking a look at the gender breakdown in the data on the dropouts that you have? My hunch would be, things like parenting and other various kind of instances and barriers would be specific by gender. And so it was as simple as being in the room to bring up a question like that could influence the way in which kind of a holistic study was looking at some specific gender data locally. Another example, Jennifer mentioned our work in early care and education. We helped to convene a group of advocates working in the child care space. And through that conversation, it came to light that there was a lot of missing data. So in that case, it is not necessarily specific to gender data, but an issue area that we feel very strongly about and certainly has a large influence on women. And so we are helping a group of advocates and researchers to piece together a data picture. And we've heard repeatedly that that's a really valuable role for us to play because we can say those things and work together with providers and advocates, and then, as Jennifer mentioned, talk to our funding colleagues about the importance of supporting those data efforts, talk to policymakers, and influence kind of bigger structures like the school system and what data that they're looking at.
Really interesting to hear that, and I think, obviously that's a lesson that can be applied to a lot of different work, just in terms of, it's a term we hear a lot, disaggregating data, and obviously, that can play kind of a major role in terms of narrowing focus and really understanding how the data affects kind of different groups. We actually had another question come in from Liz. Thanks, Liz. She's wondering, in what way has your programmatic work informed your organization's culture? So she's thinking of employment policy, decision-making tactics, etc. Curious, as she does women empowerment in nonprofit as well, but she doesn't always see these values translated to organizational culture.
That is such a great question, and I'm proud to say that it is very much a part of our organizational culture. And I feel really honored and privileged to be able to say that because I actually have the experience of working at a couple of other national women's organizations where that absolutely was not the case. So it's a privilege to be here at the Women's Foundation and really making sure that we walk the walk of the talk that we're talking. So we recently revamped all of our HR policies, I want to say a couple of years ago. It's a manual that's called Be That Woman, and I think that in and of itself, the title, it's not our employee handbook, it's our Be That Woman handbook, and I think that really captures how we approach our work and the kind of environment and culture that we really are fostering here at the Women's Foundation. It's been really interesting. I'm one of 3 people who've now been here the longest at almost 7 years. So we have a number of newer staff that have come on board the last couple of years. And I'm always fascinated to learn from each one of them that they were so excited about joining our staff because they saw things on social media that we do together as a team. So, and this may sound really silly as an example, but I think it's just a testament to the kind of culture that we're fostering here. We work really hard, but we also have a lot of fun together, and we really are a team. So, we'll do pumpkin carving contests, we have a peeps contest, but we're also good about rewarding staff when they work really hard. So, last couple weeks ago, we had our annual luncheon, which is a major undertaking. It's all hands on deck. It's just a huge undertaking for the staff, and everyone is exhausted. And so We give people a day off and we rest and recuperate. We have very, very family-friendly policies that are a part of our Be That Woman handbook. And you know, I don't know if Lauren wants to say anything else as a staff person here, but I'm really honored that I think we do an incredible job at really walking the walk. And yes, I was just reminded, we were voted one of Washington Business Journal's best places to work last year as a result of our policies.
That's great to hear. I actually recently attended a workshop, and the facilitator said something that stuck with a lot of us: culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we've something we've been repeating. So obviously you all are living that ideal. We had a couple of other questions come in. I think we have a few more minutes. One question from Rebecca: do you ever approach work from the perspective of how to improve the lives of women by working with men?
Absolutely. That's a big conversation that we're having now. Men are an important part of this work. It's not an either or, but it's about both. And this is actually a conversation we've been having most recently with a couple of local funders who are working on some My Brother's Keeper work with boys and young men of color. So really thinking about how do we come together and sort of undertake this work together, recognizing that we're not, both populations are disadvantaged and disenfranchised in our community, and both have needs and challenges. And at the end of the day, we have to be working together in order to sort of lift all boats. So I don't know, Lauren, if you want to talk a little bit more about.
Sure. You know, I would just say that I think that there are certain strategies that we're thinking about locally and nationally where investments in the community would be really co-investing in just youth and people of color, and would have similar strategies, whether it was girls and women or boys and men. And then there are other instances where it does help to look at the data and say, what are the different ways that we could be serving these populations? And so that's a conversation happening locally and nationally, fortunately.
Yeah. And then I would just add, on the philanthropic side, it's really important for us to be thinking about how do men also play into philanthropy and the role of giving around women and girls. The majority of our donors are women, but there are a whole handful of men that are giving alongside or in concert with their spouses or significant others. And particularly as we look to grow philanthropy and grow giving to women and girls, as you look at major gifts, oftentimes those decisions are made as a couple. And so it really is about both men and women, and how do we bring more men into the conversation.
We actually had another question come in from Dawn, and she's sounds like she's looking for what you really mean when you say gender lens approach and how it shifts philanthropic work. And she's wondering, would the outcomes of your funding be the same if you used economic class as a different, sort of indicator?
Sure. So I think when we're talking about a gender lens, it is thinking about the particular circumstances, barriers, and assets that girls and women would bring to life, to an education program, to a training, just their very particular circumstances. I think the easiest things to point out that regularly come up, and I mean, we sound a little bit like a broken record because these things come up so commonly, but childcare, transportation, other wraparound supports, case management. It sounds very basic, but they are things that really do regularly come up with our grantee partners. In terms of the way that maybe we would, I don't know if the investments are necessarily structured too differently. I think as a funder, we have a stance of being pretty flexible and working in close partnership with our grantees. So an example of that is that we have some new investments in the last few years in community colleges. And it is new to them in some instances to be approaching particular workforce development and training programs with a gender lens. And so we like to be flexible and allow them the ability to retool, use our funding in maybe a little bit more flexible way. So if they set out, for example, one program set out thinking that they would have a lot of single mothers in their program and were anticipating using some of our grant for childcare subsidies, it happened that the women attracted to that program actually had older children. And so there were a different set of services that were more appropriate to them, and we had no problem kind of repurposing our particular dollars for that work. So that's one way that maybe the investments look slightly differently, and we do a lot of kind of checking in and just coaching informally separately from the points in time when we have formal grant reports due from grantees. The outcomes that we're looking at, so at the high level, we're looking at changes in income and assets because we think that tells a really powerful story about the real investment in the community and these families that that our grantee partners are serving. But we are also looking at a lot of metrics that just tell us about the overall changes in health and well-being of an individual and their family. We revamped our evaluation recently, and so we're starting to look at things just how many women and girls report an increase in their happiness and well-being? How many have been exposed to new ideas about college and career opportunities? So there are those softer things that we're also looking at that help us say, a woman may still be going through an education or training program, but we can say in the interim that her family has access to new public benefits that are helping them live a healthier life. We know that the relationship with the school system is improving or amongst individuals in the family, and that can say that they're on a better path even if they haven't yet completed a training program or been placed in a new job.
Great, thank you. That was a really, I think a really comprehensive answer, and we're actually up right at about 4 p.m., so I don't think we have time for any more questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think this was a really interesting conversation. Please check back in a couple weeks for our next webinar, and I especially want to thank our speakers, Jennifer, Jessica, Lauren. We really appreciate you joining us and you taking the time to kind of share your knowledge and your expertise with our community. I think we all learned a lot, so thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely, and as a reminder, everyone, the recording slides will be up on our website within about a week, so feel free to check back if you want to review anything that you learned today. And thanks again, folks, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.